Thanks very much, and good morning, everybody. Anyone who was here last night and heard the wonderful presentations by the Ambassador and Maurice Hayes will realise that it really is a privilege to be asked to be associated with this summer school in any way. So I'm delighted to be here again to share my views with you. If you were listening to your radio yesterday around 1 o'clock, you'd have heard a report on the mental health services in South Kilkenny, in which there were 13 untimely deaths of people with mental health difficulties being investigated. And the outcome of that investigation was to put in place a proper risk management system, otherwise called a risk register, in which you give a lot of thought and you try to identify what are the risks that you are facing as an organisation. And it's common practice across all sectors it's prudent to have a risk management system in place. Now, in that context, the Taoiseach published the following words about 3 months ago. The Taoiseach said, "We must identify the risks Ireland faces, the country faces, and therefore ensure appropriate prevention and mitigation," just like the Kilkenny system. "One of the priorities for our country and people is to ensure that we learn from the mistakes of the past. Never again should dissenting voices be silenced when warning of risks up ahead. We must work to ensure that Ireland's terrible reversal of fortune never recurs." And so, in the interests of... Just skip a few slides because... Yeah. Okay. So these are the words of the Taoiseach, which are in the preface. They're the introduction to a document published around about March called a Draft National Risk Assessment. And what this document is 16 pages long. It sets out what the drafters of the document believe are the principal risks that we must address to prevent a recurrence of calamitous failure in our country. And it lists all of these risks. And if you glance at them there are things like terrorism, the breakup of the EU in some ways, weather risks, nuclear disaster risks, war, pestilence, and a lot of other risks. Now, what is most striking about these risks is that they're all mostly, by about 90% of them, are external risks to Ireland. But if you look at what the actual catastrophic failures we have had in the country here, they're internal. So if we think of just a list of them there, the collapse of the state's finances, homelessness, the water supply that we've just heard about, people still boiling, protection of children, we simply haven't got that right yet, but we're making progress. White-collar crime, do we have the capacity to deal with that risk and some of its enormous implications? And one that I didn't even remember to put on this was the system of policing and of justice. So what's striking about all of these, while the draft document talks about all these external risks, when you look at what actually happened, which ought to trigger a risk management system, they're largely internal. So there is a major blind spot in the draft risk assessment, and that is the internal risks. Now, this is not just my jaundiced view of the political system and the civil service. It is also the view of the National Economic and Social Council, which includes all the parties, government, unions, business, etc. And this is a quotation from the director of the National Economic and Social Conference in May of this year, commenting on the draft. This is the actual draft document. It was circulated, and this is a commentary from Rory O'Donnell on that draft assessment. He says, overall, the greatest risk arises not from external events, but from what is a two-pronged risk, namely our system of politics and our public administration. That's where the really dangerous risks lie. And he said there are good reasons to put these two risks centre stage in our risk management systems. whereby, while the international context is critical for Ireland, adapting our internal systems, many of which you've just heard enumerated by John Fitzgerald, our systems of policy making, administration, industrial relations, education, expertise in the civil service. Adapting our internal systems to the increasing international interdependence, that has been our weakness. Now, if anything crystallises the relevance of this summer school, and if you look at the topics through the week, it really does underline the importance of this kind of event, because this kind of event is largely, and particularly this week's theme, is about that risk. It's about the political system and the system of administration that we really do have to sort if we are to prevent the recurrence of catastrophic risk. Because a feature of the risks in Ireland is that we keep, a feature of our calamities in Ireland is that we keep repeating them. We just keep doing it. And I've just had a short list of them here. One of them was the Gardaí. The Morris Tribunal concluded Donegal was not a statistical blip. That's about a decade ago, he said that. In the meantime, we had the Duplantier case down in Cork, the fixing up of a man for the murder of that French woman. In the last couple of months, we had the penalty point saga. So we keep repeating them. Every week, you can turn on your television and watch distraught parents emerging from the forecourts with somebody in a wheelchair, having spent 10 years trying to get an apology from the health system. We haven't sorted that out. The economic boom and bust, the financial services, the bailing out of AIB more than once. Homelessness, 24th of May, 2014, the newspapers report the government is introducing new legislation to ensure that developers include social housing in their developments. When did we last hear that? That was supposed to have been sorted 4 or 5 years ago. So one of the things that we do with failures here is that we repeat them. Now, these are just some more recent comments. The IMF, I don't know how true these are, but I'm quoting from the newspapers. The IMF questions the independence of the central bank on the grounds that it's still too tight with the Department of Finance. Is that true? Now, we thought that was sorted. This is Tracy Cooper, a terrific woman who headed up HICWA and recently left Ireland. When things go wrong, she said, there's good practice and appalling practice in the HSE, and that's inexcusable. The problem is we have never had any consequences. If there's a repeated system failure, nothing really happens. She's talking about Tala Hospital, Ennis Hospital, this whole plethora of examples. We have still not cracked accountability in the health service. And all of this, repeat business, underpinned by the enduring culture of the old politics. I've just picked out one example. Newspaper headline, 79% of lottery funds available for national parks go to Kerry. That's Minister Jimmy Deanahan's constituency, and as you might have guessed. So here we are with this, somehow we seem fated to keep repeating these things and unable to come to grips with them. Now, if you keep repeating, if you have an intractable problem and you keep repeating the same thing, there are two things happening. You have not got down to the root cause. You haven't got to the root of the cancer or the malaise. And secondly, we lack the capacity to learn. What other commentators call the adaptive capacity of our systems is poor. So it looks, if you just look at the facts, it looks as if we're fated to repeat a lot of these mistakes. So is there anything that we can do about this? Now, I believe there is something that we can do about it. And the first thing is to establish the civil service as the fifth estate. And I'm quoting here from a paper that Maurice Hayes gave down in the Burren Law School about a year ago, in which Maurice advocated that the civil service be reconstituted as the fifth estate. So we know about the media as the fourth estate, for example, or the judiciary. And I'm quoting Maurice in his paper to the Padraig de Brún Memorial Lecture at NUI Galway. Maurice says, I believe that a permanent civil service performs an important and necessary function as a balancing mechanism in the machinery of government, particularly when the political power shifts in the electoral cycle, and also the fifth estate as a brake on autocracy when power does not shift. And although not specifically mentioned in the Constitution, largely because De Valera did not want to concede this role, that De Valera did not want to concede the role to the civil service of being the fifth estate. He wanted them within his own embrace. So, although not specifically mentioned in the Constitution, as an important fifth estate of Irish governance, I think this is a crucial construct. And there are a couple of features about an estate. Think of the judiciary, think of the media. Each estate has its own distinctive, indispensable role. It has a degree of separation, independence, and autonomy from the other estates. It has its own integrity, values, and culture, its own standards. It has legal protection to ensure its independence, such as journalists protecting their sources. And it acts as a brake and a bulwark and a restraint on other estates. Now, any estate fundamentally fails in its unique, indispensable role if it's co-opted or controlled by another estate. So, for example, if the judiciary is controlled by the government, it will fail in its duty. If the media is controlled by the government or other vested interests, it will fail. And if the civil service is politicised, it fails. And I would argue, and others will, and I have quotations here from many authorities to say, including civil servants, in a recent report from heads of internal audit in the civil service, that it has become over-politicised. So in order to what steps can be taken towards establishing the civil service as the fifth estate? Change the 1924 Act, which conflates the role of civil servants and ministers. Pat Rabbitt gave a scholarly paper on that at the Byrne Law School. He said that the present system that we have, the present system of accountability that we have, that we pretend to have, is grounded in a lie, whereby ministers can hide behind the skirts of civil servants and vice versa. That's the system we have at the moment. Put the civil service and the political system at the centre of the risk management system that I've just highlighted in red. Appoint a head of the civil service responsible for the adaptive capacity of the civil service, such as, do you have the specialists you need? Do you have the right legislation to support your role, and so on. John has just spent quite a bit of his presentation on give regulators the proper delegated powers to carry out invasive scrutiny and employ effective sanctions. Niamh Hardiman's written about that, Matthew Elderfield. Also to establish a spinal cord of personal accountability with personal consequences. That is missing in so many parts of the public service, particularly the health system. I'm quoting Tracy Cooper there. And I also add in something I have a hobby horse about, is to treat perjury as a crime. We don't treat perjury as a crime. So anybody can go before any tribunal in this country, it's happened dozens and dozens of times in the last decade, perjure themselves and there's no follow-up. And if you can do that, you can get away with anything. So the first thing, as I'm saying, is establish the civil service as the fifth estate. Now, I'm depicting here the other part of the equation with using the metaphor of an iceberg. Everything that I've cited there, the 1924 Act, the regulator, the adaptive capacity of the civil service, that's all technical stuff. We know what to do with that. There are dozens of reports outlining that. It's been repeated on conferences like this year in, year out. That's the technical challenge. But below the surface is the culture. And as we know, the famous saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Now, culture eats the Freedom of Information Act for breakfast. It will eat the whistleblowers thing for breakfast. It will eat the 1924 Act for breakfast. And here are just some quotes from recent and not so recent discourse. Judge Smithick: culture places loyalty to colleagues and protection of the institution before the truth. So you can have all the rules you like for the Gardaí to obey, but the culture devours those rules, bypasses them. Bertie Ahern: the only ethics are the ethics of being re-elected. That was his response to what do you think about the new ethics and standards in public office document. He said, well, the only ethics are the ethics of being re-elected. Gareth Fitzgerald, in his 2 final Irish Times articles, put his finger on this. before he died, our failures have a common factor: deficiencies in civic morality, socially defective value system. And at the bottom I quote an interview with John Wilson, one of the whistleblowers. He was asked by the journalist, "Do you feel vindicated?" He said, "Perhaps only if it leads to a change in culture of transparency and accountability in Ireland." It's not a done deal that he somehow was vindicated. There can be no reform without cultural reform. And in 2011 here at MacGill, I put up this slide, in which I cited from the newspaper commentary, from public comment, on the dysfunction of a whole series of institutions: FÁS, the HSE, developers, the banks, the Guardian Donegal, the Catholic Church, Fianna Fáil, the Central Bank, medical, a whole raft of them. And the commentary was about the culture, that the culture is dysfunctional, and that's the deep problem. In the last few months, because of events, I've added in the Gardaí countrywide, the penalty points, the inquiry into murders and so on. There are 250 new cases being handled by a team of 5 barristers, which have been submitted to do with alleged breakdown in Garda behaviour. Tala Hospital, the juvenile prison, and this is some of the language that is being used: the culture of concealment, loyalty before truth, and so on. So, coming back to this here, I want to quote from something else. It is that we need these structural or technical changes, which I'm putting above the surface of the iceberg. But one of the failures we introduce these new systems. The clearest example is GSOC. After the Morris Tribunal, we put in place this system, but it has holes in it. And we keep putting in place these new arrangements, but they just are not quite the real deal. They're full of loopholes, which allow for what John talked about: ministerial and civil service intervention. And I'm quoting here from the current issue of Studies from Bill Kingston in Trinity College. "The blunt truth is that the Irish state, governed by a combination of intervention favouring civil servants and politicians, elected by the existing voting system, is no longer viable. The point being that if you don't have a rules-based system that's tight, you leave it to the discretion of the administrators and the political system." And that's where so many of these problems have occurred. A standout example of the opposite to that was Owen Keegan, Dublin City Manager, who said, "Here is the law on concerts, and I am not changing this." And he couldn't be got at because there was a set of rules. That is quite an exceptional instance in large swathes of the public service. So intervention favouring, and why is intervention favoured? Because it means you have power, you have control, you can dispense patronage, and so on. So there's no point giving us a new bucket if the bucket has a hole in it. And that's one of the problems with many of the reforms that have been introduced. So in addition to those technical things, getting them right, we also need an explicit programme for cultural reform. Now, the OECD in 2008 said the biggest asset the Irish public service has, and John Fitzgerald commented on it, was in fact their values. Decent people, good people. But it said that there is a need to codify the values of the civil service, and I'm quoting from OECD, and to systematically embed these values in the hearts and minds of the staff. That is not a technical challenge, it's a developmental challenge. It's a challenge of formation of civil servants, not training. Also, to attach primacy to the public interest. Again, John talked about that. The public interest is not always the same as the interest of the minister or the interest of the civil service. I would advocate that every statement of strategy in the public service and every annual report in the public service be given a page on culture. Demand it. It forces people to render the topic of culture discussable. Make cultural reform a priority for the new head of the civil service. I'll maybe come back to that at the end. And carry out a regular audit. In the absence of an explicit programme of cultural reform, of cultural formation, in the absence of an explicit programme, in the words of my friend Don Thornhill down here, the hidden curriculum takes over. So a nurse, a guard joins the civil service full of idealism. Within 10 days, they'll learn the score. If I were you, I wouldn't speak up about that, and so on. So, just to move on. Yeah, okay. So, I'm coming to the conclusion. Culture and character. Talking about culture, this is not a spectator sport. Culture, not a whisper from the other 13. Isn't it strange, the Commissioner said, that there were only 2 people spoke up, and not a whisper from the other 13,000? That's the culture. Doctors not willing to blow the whistle on their colleagues. Loyalty, a primal instinct, according to Fintan O'Toole. But character, we see it in individuals. Maurice McCabe, John Wilson, Father McGinty in Maynooth, the nurse in Our Lady of Lourdes Hospital, Louise O'Keefe, the Collins family in Limerick, and Lear Varadkar. Why do I cite Varadkar? Because Varadkar was the one who has twice burst the bubble of collusion surrounding various issues. When he was asked were logistical logarithmic progressions an adequate basis for assigning primary care centres, he was asked without a stroke, he said yes. When the wagons were circling by all parties, colluding in leaving the 2 whistleblowers out to dry, Leo Varadkar said he would describe them as distinguished and not as disgusting. So individual moral courage is the key. Finally, loyalty is a noble virtue. Circling the wagons, whistleblowing, etc. are not loyalty. We must not dignify loyalty with what in fact is ignoble collusion or even criminal conspiracy. We must work then, in conclusion and repeating, we must work to ensure Ireland's terrible reversal of fortune never occurs. The purpose of the risk management system is to identify the risks we face and ensure prevention and mitigation. Overall, the greatest risk arises not from external events, but from a 2-pronged risk: our system of politics, our system of public administration. I've largely commented on the second one, but in particular, individuals. So what we need are the missing piece. What we need more than anything else is leaders within the political system and within the civil service who have the courage to challenge the culture of their own tribe. That is the bottom line for me. So in summary, the biggest risk to further calamities are the deep flaws and shortcomings, for all their strengths, of our political system and the civil service. My bet is on the civil service, because politics is such a precarious career. I think that I simply don't expect the political system to make the changes that are necessary here. But I think that we can have some confidence that the civil service will. Civil servants have much to gain and little to lose by these changes. Structural, legal oversight, these technical things, we have to go the whole way with those. No more new buckets with holes in it. No reform without cultural reform and explicit programme. Collusion and criminality are not loyalty. And finally, it's not a spectator sport. It's up to people like you and me. Now, before I finish, Joe has asked me to announce a new item on the arts section of our programme. It's a play that will be performed later this week. And the play is called Nothing Really Happens. And the authors are, it's a tragedy in 6 or more acts by Muintir na hÉireann. And that's from Dr. Tracy Cooper. And it's inspired by Tracy Cooper's statement, is the problem is we have never had any consequences. If there is repeated systems failure, nothing really happens. So, what happens after the play starts? What happens after a calamity in Ireland, a tragedy in 6 acts? Act 1 is called What Calamity? The storyline, the plot is denial, whistleblower reprisal, and circle the wagons. Memorable lines. They should go and commit suicide. The man is not well. Who said that? P. Flynn about Tom Gilmartin. And his wife is not well either. Frankly, I find it disgusting. The Garda Commissioner. That's Act 1. Act 2 is the cover-up. And the cover-up means delay, self-serving terms of reference, and internal inquiry. Safe pair of hands. Some examples, only administrative shortcomings. Judge Mahan said that corruption was rampant at all levels in the planning system. But an internal investigation into 6 county councils, including Donegal, reported only some administrative shortcomings. And by the way, that's still in play because it's been challenged. Also, Deputy Commissioner of the Guards carried out an investigation into penalty points. Guess how many he found? 8. 8 examples of malpractice. 8. And all of those have been sorted. So that's your internal inquiry. Third one is the snow job. Now, the difference between a cover-up and a snow job is the cover-up is a deliberate cover-up. It's naive to see it as anything else. The snow job is, this is a sincere attempt now to finally get to the bottom of it. But in fact, it really isn't, because it's a fake sincerity, still terms of reference too narrow. The report unfolds. There is delay, missing files, perjury, redaction, sanitization of the report. As another colleague of mine says, the mice get at it before it gets published. And they also get their spin in first. Some of the memorable lines are, on the advice of the Attorney General, we have to redact it or we can't. Another one is, the main point of the report is, this is where they get their retaliation in first. Another one, very common recently, RTE has learned from good sources that, and you get the spin of some of the protagonists in the report. And also, in any case, it was a systems failure. So that's the snow job. I'm nearly finished now. The next act is 5 to 10 years on. Half the actors have died, and so on. They can't remember. Patrick Neary, amnesia. All is revealed. And now we think we really are getting to the bottom of it. So you have an independent, courageous investigator, proper terms of reference, Geiran, Mahan, Tracy Cooper, many others, unambiguous findings. They call it as they see it, no messing around, no circumlocution. Hope at last. Some memorable lines. Donegal was not a statistical blip. Morris didn't pull the punches. A culture that favours loyalty to colleagues over the truth. Judge Smithick. Limerick A&E is not fit for purpose. Tracy Cooper. So at last we think we've got progress. But what happens then is a waste of a good crisis. An Irish solution to an Irish problem. A new bucket with a hole in it. GSOC, classic example. Niamh Hardiman, in a book I have here, talks about regulators. John has talked about that. Regulators who don't have the proper terms of reference to do their job. Severe implementation deficit disorder all over the place. And no personal consequences. Some of the memorable lines are, we have now put in place a world-class system, which isn't a world-class system. Mr. X has been appointed as Ireland's representative on the United Nations, whatever it is, or the European, whatever it is. And of course, he was the best candidate possible for that job, an outstanding candidate for that job. That's another conclusion. And the final act, I'm afraid, is The Empire Strikes Back. And The Empire Strikes Back with reformers are seen off the premises, the old culture re-emerges and eats the reforms, and the old guard regain control. Nothing really happens. Have a nice day.